And Chung, and the following presentation is based off of my dissertation titled Coping with Ethnic Microaggression in Chinese Immigrants. Just to cover some key terms, microaggression isn't a new term, but Daryl Wing Su in 2007 was really the first to explore experiences of microaggression with the Asian American population. Microaggressions can be further categorized into microassaults, microinsults, and microinvalidations. Acculturation is also an important term for this study. So, research has found that the ambiguous nature of microaggressions can be particularly damaging, as the target individual may use a considerable amount of psychological and emotional effort trying to distinguish the intent of a comment, whether or not to be offended by it, and then what to do about it. Research has shown the cumulative effects of microaggression can lead to negative outcomes as measured by feelings of self-doubt, frustration, and isolation. Researchers have also found that acculturation factors have been associated with the underutilization of mental health services in Asian Americans, and there have been inconsistencies in research related to seeking support or help-seeking behaviors in minority individuals or Asian American individuals. So these were the following research questions for this study. What is the experience of ethnic microaggression in Chinese immigrants in the acculturation process? How have their experiences of microaggression differed in their country of origin compared to within the United States? How might one cope with these experiences using family or other supports? The method used was a qualitative study method with a phenomenological approach. The inclusion criteria were that participants must be between the ages of 18 to 25, have immigrated to the U.S. from China, Hong Kong, or Taiwan in the last 5 years, and be proficient in English in order to complete the interview. We collected data through the use of informed consent forms, demographics forms, as well as semi-structured interviews that were either done face-to-face or through video call platforms. These were the interview questions used for the study. They really, just to outline, asked participants whether they had heard of the term microaggression, how they made sense of the term, asked participants to share their experiences of microaggression both in the U.S. and before coming to the U.S., and also how they sought support from family, friends, or anyone else. And then just to finish, there was an open-ended question. So the following is a participant demographics form. In total, there were 8 participants of the study. There was an equal gender ratio of male to female. 7 were 23, 1 was 22. The majority of participants had migrated at age 18 or 19, 1 had migrated at 22, and all had migrated alone for either undergraduate or graduate studies. So this slide just shows some very powerful quotes taken from the interviews and transcripts. One participant had talked about being asked, "Where are you from originally?" or "How did you learn English?" One participant was asked, "Hey, can I order some Chinese from you?" One participant had talked about being called polite and asked if it was because he was Asian. One participant talked about feeling an invisible pressure. So these are some quotes pulled from Reactions and Coping in the U.S. One participant had talked about not wanting family members in their country of origin to worry about them. One had, quote, said, "It's better to just talk about it, and then I feel much better. I feel much release." Another participant had said, "It's like the small battles that we always fight, challenging people one at a time." And then another participant had said, "Sometimes maybe it's not discrimination, but in some ways you will feel like you were discriminated. Maybe that's kind of a burden for us once you know the kind of discrimination is going on." These are quotes from Reactions and Coping in Country of Origin. One had talked about feeling more defensive if she had experienced those same microaggressions in the U.S. compared to experiencing them in her country of origin. And another had talked about how it can be hard to change people's attitudes or impressions. So for 2 participants, they had talked about this really being their first time discussing these experiences at all. One had said, quote, "It was interesting. I think it was challenging to articulate some of the stuff that I think has been sitting around in a crystallized state in my head. It's stuff that I don't really bring out that much." And another participant had described the interview as a therapeutic process for him. Many had talked about having an increased self-awareness after this interview process. And another participant had talked about her perceptions of her experiences actually shifting through the interview. So she had said, "If you didn't ask me today, I wouldn't feel like it was microaggression." So some findings from the study were that there were fewer reported experiences of microaggression in participants' country of origin versus in the US, which was to be expected. Common themes across the US and country of origin were language ability, which is consistent with research in that language proficiency plays a major role in acculturative stress. Another common theme in the US and country of origin was positive stereotyping. A theme that was unique to the country of origin was the idolization of foreigners. We also found that there was a significant social component, which is no surprise, as microaggression itself is a phenomenon that occurs purely in social interactions, and was in alignment with research that found that social stress, social anxiety, and anger were mediators between experiences of microaggression and developmental difficulties in adolescence. Some more findings from this study were that there were several common reactions and coping across the US and the country of origin. These were strong affective responses, personal reflection, and aspirational. So it was clear that experiences of microaggression in both the US and participants' country of origin resulted in negative affects such as anger, confusion, discomfort, and distress. These results aligned with existing research that microaggression can predict mental health issues such as depressive and somatic symptoms. Some participants felt unsure whether their experiences were due to personality characteristics or ethnicity. What seemed sure for several participants was the importance of awareness of stereotypes the majority population may hold about them. Research has shown or has proposed the stereotype content model, which categorized anti-Asian American stereotypes falling under two dimensions, excessive competence and deficient sociability, which was true for participants of this study. These stereotypes seem to impact how individuals perceived and operated in social interactions, as well as their sense of ethnic identity. So research has been inconsistent with coping. Asian Americans and recent immigrants have been shown to be less likely to engage in help-seeking behaviors due to a need to fulfill the stereotype as a problem-free minority. Findings from this study indicated that most participants attempted to seek support from friends or family. There were gender differences, and that shared meaning-making was specific to coping in the US. This may have been due to fewer reported experiences of microaggression in participants' country of origin, but also could mean that this is an effective coping strategy for recent Chinese immigrants in the US. So this shared meaning-making involved turning to family, same-minority relationships in efforts to process their experiences, and was reminiscent of collectivist practices, which would be consistent with research that Asian Americans utilize coping strategies that are congruent with their collectivistic culture of origin. However, participants seemed to feel most heard and validated when engaging in shared meaning-making with peers compared to adults. And this may have been due to migrating alone, as well as different levels of westernization or acculturation, leading to greater family disconnectedness. So in terms of acculturative stress and ethnic identity, there's one hypothesis that stronger ethnic identity leads to stronger sense of alienation and greater acculturative stress. And one participant commented on a friend who grew up on the West Coast in a strong Asian community and hence felt more enraged when experienced microaggression on the East Coast. Another opposing hypothesis is that the stronger the ethnic identity leads to stronger sense of belonging and acts as a buffer for discrimination experiences. And another participant in this study commented on a friend who was American-born and may have felt more distressed because of an accumulation of experiences of discrimination. So those were the major findings. You'll next hear from my discussant, San, who is an MSPP alum. I'd like to thank her for dedicating her time to this presentation, and my committee members, Chairperson Shamala Venkataraman, second member Lionel Joseph, third member Catherine Vuki, as well as Mario Murga for his passion for this important issue.
Thank you, Wei, for inviting me to be a part of this very important discussion. When I started reading Wei's research, I was immediately drawn in. It spoke to me on both a personal and professional level. She opens her introductory chapter with a question, "Where are you actually from?" to which I found myself smiling in recognition. For the longest time, whenever someone asked me where I'm from, I generally turn the question back on them by saying, "Well, what are you really asking?" Usually people don't have an answer to that question, and so I find myself giving a mini personal history instead of the 2-second answer that they were probably expecting. But when I started to read the research, I stopped and asked myself, why do I do that? Has it just become the strange habit of preempting the inevitable follow-up questions? Well, I mean, where were you born? Or where are your parents from? Or are you Korean? Chinese? I find that I don't react that much to this question anymore. Maybe that's a sign of the comfort that I've gradually built over the past many years, the comfort in my ethnic identity as a Chinese American, and in my generational identity as 1.5, which is to say, comfort in being uncomfortable as I continue to straddle the line between two cultures. When I was younger, I don't think I thought much about my ethnic identity as much as the identity of being an outsider, a foreigner, was forced upon me. I grew up in the Chinese restaurant business. The compliment that I got the most often then was that I spoke English well. It would be expressed in different ways, to which I usually responded to with a smile and a thank you. But for the longest time, I couldn't understand why a compliment could make me feel so terrible, perhaps even ashamed. It speaks to the confusion, the uncertainty, the internal turmoil, as Wei pointed out, that an individual might experience in trying to figure out what a statement like that might mean. I spent a lot of time wondering whether I was being too sensitive or making a big deal out of nothing. It also speaks to the nature of exceptionalizing stereotypes in which I was marked as unique for being a good English speaker, while others that look like me, say my family working in the same restaurant, are expected to be poor at English. In therapy, I find that most of my patients don't talk much about racism and discrimination, let alone microaggressions, at least not explicitly. One young woman sought out therapy to deal with the difficulties she faced as the only international employee on staff in a small company. She told me that she was struggling with her communication skills because her supervisor was having a hard time understanding her and thought that she was being defensive and passive-aggressive in their interactions. She questioned her ability to express herself in English as a native Mandarin speaker. To me, I perceived her as being quite fluent and articulate without a strong accent. She later explained to me that she's a thoughtful and analytical person who needs time to process information before responding. She also acknowledged that she has trouble matching the emotionality of her white coworkers in terms of their tone of voice and facial expressions. I wondered whether it was this characteristic of being more reserved compared to her white counterparts that led her supervisor to conclude that she was quote-unquote defensive and passive-aggressive. Although the supervisor came away with a negative interpretation, similar characteristics seemed to be perceived positively in one participant in Wei's study. This participant was reflecting on an interaction with a white man that he was helping at work. The participant was told that he was very polite, and then he was asked if it was because he was. In reflecting on this positive stereotype, the participant referenced the model minority myth, saying, for Asian people, the stereotype might be hardworking, quiet, doesn't raise a fuss, is generally trying to be agreeable or fall in line, following the rules. When I think about the patients that I see, I can imagine that outside of therapy walls, many of them go about their daily lives under this facade. They put their heads down, go to work, come home, repeat the same routine the next day. If conflicts arise at home, they're heading behind closed doors, and if conflicts arise in the community, especially when they involve non-Asians, they try their best to smooth things over and not create a fuss. Inside of therapy walls, however, I see a pattern in these strong feelings of guilt, shame, and anger that is often buried underneath the symptoms of depression and anxiety that they struggle with daily. Some feel guilty or ashamed that they're not living up to what they perceive to be their family's values and expectations or society's expectations for them. Some feel angry about having such expectations to live up to in the first place, and some feel bad for feeling angry. The term model minority was first coined by a sociologist, William Peterson, in his New York Times article titled Success Story, Japanese American Style. It became a popular way to describe the seeming success of Asian Americans, and I would argue primarily East Asians, in overcoming discrimination and achieving the American dream to some degree. But in reality, what the stereotype does is render the very broad group of Asian Americans, which contains many distinct ethnic groups quite different from one another, invisible. It obscures their needs because it makes it seem that since as a whole group they're doing so well, they're not in need of help. It also obscures the level of discrimination that they face. In a way, it's become a label used to put Asians in their place and other minorities in theirs. It becomes a divisive tactic that pits one minority group against another. So how do people cope with this? Existing literature shows that as a whole, Asian Americans are less likely to engage in help-seeking behaviors. When figuring out how to cope on an individual basis, participants in Way's study described a sense of complacency. They described how being aware of discrimination and microaggression is a burden. One participant reported becoming intensely aware of himself and his behavior. Another felt the need to overreact, overcompensate, and change people's stereotypical perceptions of him. Some felt inspired to take action and to begin to ask, why? Why did this happen? I found it interesting that none of the participants reached out for support in their academic settings. One participant who had experienced a microaggression in class found it hard to reach out to a professor and ultimately decided against it. She noted the racial tension and discomfort that her white classmates seemed to experience when racial conflict was discussed. I feel like whenever we talk about race, people don't want to have a strong opinion, especially for white people. This is a very sensitive topic, so people don't want to argue just because it has a long history. To begin my conclusion, I want to share a quote from Larry Summers, who is a president emeritus and university professor of Harvard University. He's made some very controversial statements in the past, which I won't repeat here, but his recent comments on political correctness on campus and quote-unquote overdoing the idea of microaggression gave me some food for thought. He says, "There is a great deal of absurd political correctness. Now, I'm somebody who believes very strongly in diversity, who resists racism in all of its many incarnations, who thinks that there is a great deal that's unjust in American society that needs to be combated. But it seems to be that there's a kind of creeping totalitarianism in terms of what kind of ideas are acceptable and are debatable on college campuses. And I think that's hugely unfortunate. I think the answer to bad speech is different speech. The answer to bad speech is not shutting down speech." He goes on to talk about a suggestion that was put forward in recent years that the law of rape should not be covered at Harvard Law School because it would be a painful experience for some law students. He then says, "The idea that somehow microaggressions in the form of a racist statement contained in a novel should be treated in parallel with violence or actual sexual assault seems to me to be crazy. And I worry very much that if our leading academic institutions become places that prize comfort over truth, that prize the pursuit of mutual understanding over the pursuit of better and more accurate understanding, then a great deal will be lost. Lost in terms of the education of students, lost in terms of a model for society based on the authority of ideas rather than the idea of authority. And based on what will be lost if what's comfortable is prized over what's uncomfortable. Because what history teaches, the history of ideas, of anything, teaches that the greatest progress almost always involves ideas that are initially hugely uncomfortable for the existing order." His comments gave me food for thought, especially in light of the recent election outcome and the growing number of news detailing not only microaggressions but blatant acts of racism against various minority groups that are occurring all over the country. These recent events have highlighted how incredibly divided our country is. I have patients who have already shared their intense fear and anxiety over what the future holds for the family as they worry about whether or not their spouses, generally the sole breadwinner in the family, will be deported. These patients have young children and elderly parents who are dependent on them. And while I have not yet had patients talk about being targeted racially since the election has concluded, I can only prepare myself to create that space for them when they do. Considering the damage that microaggressions inflict and the difficulty that individuals may have in making sense of it on their own and then seeking support for it, it's incredibly important for people to be mindful of this struggle and to shed light on it. I believe any individual has the ability to create a space for open dialogue. As Wei found in her research, participants found it therapeutic to have an open conversation about their experiences of microaggression. While there may be burden and awareness, as some participants have mentioned, there's also burden in struggling in ignorance without fully understanding why. When you're already questioning your feelings about the interaction you just had, you're less likely to speak out and seek support. And so because this burden can be so isolating, it's especially important for clinicians to take responsibility to create that opening for dialogue. Just as we evaluate for incidents of abuse and bullying during an initial session, we can also make it a point to further inquire about experiences of racism and discrimination. It may then create an opportunity to provide education around the concept of microaggressions.